Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 21 of the American Pageant titled The Furnace of the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. As always, we're going to be using the 16th edition of the American Pageant. If you have an earlier or a later edition or a completely different textbook, don't worry about it, the content's going to be the same. To start off, here are the key concepts for this chapter. These are located at the beginning of every chapter in the American Pageant. I know I say this every time, but really do try to match the key terms in the chapter to the key concepts here, because it will really help you organize your information, and it will be super useful on the AP exam when you have to memorize stuff and recall it quickly, so I definitely recommend you try it. Okay, so to start off, let's talk about the battles of the Civil War. This is the chapter where we really talk about what exactly happens during the war. So the first battle of the Civil War that you need to know about is Bull Run in 1861. And to provide a little bit of background, many people, including Lincoln, really just wanted to get the war over with, wanted it to end quickly. So people suggested that he directly attack Richmond, Virginia, which was at the time the Confederate capital. Lincoln, however, decides to capture Bull Run or Manassas Junction, which was very close to Richmond. However, the South ends up winning this battle, which makes them dangerously overconfident. They just believe that they're invincible and that they're capable of anything, possibly capable of winning the war. And the North realizes that this war is not going to be a swift victory. It is going to take time and effort, and basically it's not going to be the swift victory they hope for. Another battle you should know about is the Peninsula Campaign in 1862. Lincoln orders Union General George McClellan to seize Richmond, and he decides to attack by water. When he does, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee successfully pushes him back. And although this is a costly failure for the Union, if they had won, the Union would have been restored with no effect on the institution of slavery domestically. Slavery probably would have continued unaffected, and ultimately it would have taken even more time to get it completely abolished. Or it may have never been abolished, but essentially, trust the process. That's kind of the takeaway from this. So following this defeat, the Union strategy will now shift to a 5-part total war plan. First, they have to blockade the South to prevent any trading. Then they have to free slaves in order to undermine the Southern economy, because remember, the South is just completely reliant on slaves. If they don't have slaves, they can't get money, they can't progress in the war. Then you have to get control of the Mississippi River in order to divide and conquer the Confederacy. Then you have to send troops to Georgia and the Carolinas, and finally capture Richmond, the capital, and defeat the Confederacy's biggest strength. Once you got Richmond, you basically can tear down the entire Confederacy. However, soon enough, conflicts surrounding the blockade, which, as you know, is the first step of this plan, arose when a Confederate ship known as the Merrimac destroyed 2 Union ships that were enforcing the blockade and threatened to destroy the entire fleet. So the Union fires back with a monitor ship and brings the conflict to a standstill. You don't really need to know about this whole encounter, but just so you know how the plan is received. And finally, another important battle you should know about is Antietam. This also happens in 1862, and this is a really bloody conflict on both sides, and it ends up ultimately in a draw or a stalemate, but it shows the prowess of the Union Army. It also prevents foreign intervention that would have aided the South, because countries knew that they would get backlash from the North. So now all countries are just backing out. Remember, we talked about with King Cotton. Cotton was not enough to convince European countries to help the Confederacy in any way, so they're just pretending like they never were there in the first place. Meanwhile, this victory, although not technically a victory, but this quote-unquote victory, allows Lincoln to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about how Lincoln's focus is shifting from simply upholding and preserving the Union to actually abolishing slavery. And this really starts with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which liberated slaves in the Confederate States, or really any state in rebellion. And this meant that the border states could still keep their slaves, because, as we know, they were the slave states who stayed in the Union. They didn't rebel. And Lincoln was very careful about doing this. He wanted to release this after a Union victory, specifically because he didn't want it to seem like he was only liberating the slaves to use them in the army, that he was only guaranteeing the slaves' freedom because he would personally gain from it. He wants to make sure that he's coming across as, I want to abolish slavery on moral grounds, not just for my own benefit. So the focus of the war has officially shifted from preserving the Union to abolishing slavery nationwide. But ultimately, this didn't do much to free slaves on its own. So Lincoln has revealed that abolishing slavery nationwide is his ultimate goal from the Civil War, not just preserving the Union. And some people, maybe not the North, but some people feel almost lied to, like, wait, I thought this was just about the Union. Why are you bringing slavery into this? So this will further create tensions during the war. And thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves escaped to Union states, and some even enlist to fight in the Army, like the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. However, African American soldiers were often subject to discrimination and lower pay, which foreshadows the societal inequality that would occur even after the abolition of slavery, which we'll get to in later chapters. However, they hoped it would help them eventually gain citizenship by proving themselves capable. And so eventually, the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, prohibiting slavery and involuntary servitude. I'll talk more about this and the other Reconstruction Amendments a little bit more, but it was mentioned briefly in this chapter, which is why I'm just mentioning it here. And this amendment is really important because it really allowed slaves in Confederate states to be freed. Although the Emancipation Proclamation did technically say that slaves are freed, a lot of the slaves didn't actually know this. So for example, the holiday Juneteenth, it was announced on June 19th, 1865, to the slaves in Texas that they were technically freed, even though they were freed back in 1863. They didn't know that they were freed because of the Emancipation Proclamation. But now, with the 13th Amendment, they legally had to be set free. So Juneteenth is definitely an important holiday in that sense. Okay, so let's go back to talking a little bit more about battles. You don't really need to know about individual battles for test day, but I do think it's important just to know generally about the most important ones because it'll really help you bring in some outside information and provide a little bit of context to a document on like a DBQ. So the first one you need to know about is the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. This happened in Pennsylvania, and it marked another Union victory, which was amazing, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation. It really turned the tide of the war in favor of the Union. Essentially, Confederate General George Pickett charges at Northern lines and fails, and this marks a true defeat for the South, who never again managed to invade the North. So essentially, the Southern cause is doomed. Following the Battle of Gettysburg, you have the Gettysburg Address, also in 1863. Lincoln gives a speech at a cemetery for Gettysburg soldiers where he frames the war as a means of upholding liberty. So, in other words, it's not just about abolishing slavery, it's doing what the country was founded upon, liberty and justice for all. Another one you should know about is Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in 1862. These ones aren't super important, but they do serve as good outside information, and they were in the textbook, so I decided to include them here anyways. But this was a battle in Tennessee where Union General Grant demands the unconditional surrender of the Confederate Army. This is a Union victory that also allowed them to secure Tennessee. And then lastly, for this slide, we have the Battle of Shiloh, where General Grant hopes to build up on his victory from Fort Henry and wins this battle at the Tennessee-Mississippi border despite a strong Confederate counterattack. So again, the North is clearly winning right now, and the South is really getting nervous with this. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about the end of the Civil War. For one, you have the Siege of Vicksburg in 1862. This was a 2-month-long siege on a Confederate fort that housed vital supplies like cattle and munitions. Vicksburg finally surrendered to General Grant, giving the Union full control of the Mississippi River and effectively splitting the South into two. So now that the South is divided, they aren't really going to have the strongest way of communication, because remember, they don't have a good transportation system, they don't have an established government or navy, they don't really have much going for them in general. So this is really key in getting the South back into the Union. And you see this growing sense of Union pride with Sherman's March in 1864. Essentially, the Union General William Sherman, who was in charge of seizing Georgia, employed a total war tactic as he burned down the area, destroying infrastructure and civilian property. This truly diminished Southern morale and destroyed potential Confederate supplies. Okay, so let's very briefly talk about the election of 1864, because although there is still a war going on, an election is taking place, and this is going to be a very tense situation for Lincoln. You see this with the Congressional Committee on the Conduct of the War, which is pretty straightforward based on the name. It was made up of radical Republicans who disliked the immense power that was given to the president, but also agitated Lincoln to advocate for emancipation. So they're saying Lincoln has too much power, but at the same time, he's not doing enough. However, on the other hand, you had the Copperheads, who were Northern Democrats that wanted to obstruct the war effort, that wanted to stop it. And they essentially criticized Lincoln, the draft, and emancipation. One of the most notable members of this, Clement Vallandigham, was even tried by a military tribunal for, quote, treasonable utterances, in this case, sedition. So if you don't know, Copperhead is basically a snake. Well, it's not basically a snake, it is a snake, but essentially Copperheads were literally snakes during this time because Lincoln is trying to just manage the war, and they're just piling on all of this chaos that he does not need at the moment. So that's how I remember them. However, despite his trial, Vallandigham continued to condemn Lincoln and gained some political support for it, which inspired Edward Everett Hale to write, quote, A Man Without a Country in 1863, which further increased loyalty to the Union. Another group you should know about is the Union Party. This was essentially the Republican Party that combined with the pro-war Democrats and ran Abraham Lincoln as a candidate, with Andrew Johnson being the VP. And at first, Lincoln's chances of re-election were pretty slim. Some accused him of being too ready to compromise with the South, lacking force, and generally losing the war. They really didn't think they were going to win the Civil War under Lincoln's leadership. But following the series of Union victories that we talked about before, Lincoln is reelected, which further lowers Southern morale. Okay, let's briefly elaborate on the end of the Civil War. This won't really be too much, nothing too important, but it is mentioned in the textbook, so I'm just going to put it here. For one, you have the Wilderness Campaign in 1864. Grant launches a series of brutal and fatal attacks in Virginia, leading to public outcry against, quote, Grant the Butcher. Another one you should know about is the Appomattox Courthouse in 1865. This happened following the capture of Richmond, Virginia, which is the Confederacy's capital, and Lee's troops are forced to surrender here. This marks the official end of the Civil War, as Richmond is eventually burned down. And unfortunately, a few days after the war has ended, when Lincoln is at a theater, a pro-Southern man named John Wilkes Booth shoots Lincoln and eventually kills him. Although Southerners cheered at first because their pro-Northern president was gone, they soon came to realize that they would not be reintegrated into the Union as calmly and as moderately as Lincoln would have done. Lincoln would probably have been somewhat forgiving. He would have been rather lenient and would have allowed for an easy reintegration of the South into the Union. But now the North is so upset at the South, like beyond upset. They've wasted time and resources trying to keep the South into the Union and abolishing slavery, so they will not let them in lightly. There is going to be a lot of consequences and penalties, as we'll see in later chapters. However, this violent and deadly conflict was the supreme test of the strength of American democracy. So countries that had at first doubted whether America's political experiment in democracy would even work were sort of silenced now, because they realized, yes, although there was this incredibly bloody conflict, democracy had prevailed and America had created a sustainable political environment. And last thing you need to know about is the Reform Bill of 1867, where Britain becomes an established political democracy, which shows how the domestic success of liberty had international impacts. So now that people are seeing that democracy is a viable way of running a country, they're starting to try it for themselves. So America is saying, look, I did this, I survived, you can do it too. So it's sort of like an inspirational little moment. But yeah, there are definitely still improvements that need to be made in the future. So yeah, that does it for this chapter. Here are the credits for how we got everything you just saw. Thank you so much for watching. Comment below if you have any questions. Be sure to like and subscribe, all of that, you know the drill. And yeah, see you in the next one.